Racist hotel kicks out black man not knowing he's about to own the place. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. Daniel Carter stepped into the Carlton Hotel, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly, his polished shoes gleaming against the marble floor. He exuded success, an air of confidence that came not from privilege, but from years of relentless hard work. Yet none of that mattered to the staff behind the front desk. The moment Daniel entered the lobby, he could feel it. Those judgmental glances, those quick exchanges between the bellboys, as if his presence disrupted the delicate balance of their world. Daniel's rise to wealth had been anything but smooth. From a young age, he'd faced countless obstacles. Growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood, he was no stranger to the sting of being judged unfairly. But he had made it his mission to rise above those challenges, to prove that nothing could hold him back. Now, as a self-made millionaire and successful real estate investor, Daniel had earned the right to be anywhere he wanted, yet prejudice still followed him. The Carlton Hotel was the epitome of luxury. Golden chandeliers hung overhead, casting a warm glow on the opulent furniture that lined the lobby. The marble floor beneath Daniel's feet reflected the grandeur of a place designed for the elite. But beneath all the polish and glamour, there was something else. A sense of arrogance, an air of exclusivity that didn't welcome everyone equally. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, barely looked up as Daniel approached the desk. When she did, her eyes skimmed over him quickly, noting the suit, the shoes, but stopping at his skin. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with forced politeness. Before Daniel could respond, the manager appeared behind her, a tall blonde man with a polished look, every inch of him exuding the hotel's elitist culture. He glanced at Daniel and immediately stepped forward. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any available rooms," the manager, Jack Sanders, said with a rehearsed smile that didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't the lack of rooms that was the problem, and Daniel knew it. It was the unspoken rules of the place, the silent judgment based on skin color and assumptions. Daniel had experienced this kind of treatment before, but now it barely fazed him. He didn't argue, didn't offer his identity or his status as a successful businessman. Why should he? These people would soon realize just how wrong they were. Without a word, he turned and headed for the exit, the clicks of his shoes echoing in the grand lobby. As he reached the revolving doors, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the reception desk. The staff had already returned to their duties, oblivious to the reality of what was about to happen. Because what none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that Daniel Carter was in the final stages of purchasing this very hotel. The Carlton was his next big acquisition. It had taken months of quiet negotiations, with Daniel working behind the scenes to finalize the deal without revealing his involvement. He hadn't needed to announce himself today. In fact, it had been a test, an opportunity to see the attitudes of the staff up close, to gauge the culture he was about to inherit. As he stepped out onto the busy streets of New York, Daniel couldn't help but smile to himself. Their world, their smug little bubble of exclusivity, was about to be turned upside down. Daniel's mind wandered briefly to his past. His childhood had been filled with challenges that would have broken many. Growing up in a poor neighborhood, he had seen firsthand how systemic prejudice shaped people's lives. He had watched as his parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, always told by society that they were not enough because of their skin color and where they came from. But Daniel had refused to accept that narrative for himself. From a young age, he decided he would write his own story. He had worked harder than anyone else, through school, through multiple jobs, eventually landing in the world of real estate, where he built his empire brick by brick. Daniel had taken risks others were too afraid to take. He had played the long game, and now he stood at the top. The Carlton was just another move in his larger plan. It wasn't just about acquiring a luxurious property. It was about sending a message, proving that no barrier, no matter how deeply ingrained in society, could hold him back. Daniel Carter left the Carlton with a sense of calm confidence. He knew that the journey ahead wasn't just about signing papers or making financial gains. The Carlton was more than a business acquisition. It was a chance to reshape a system that had for too long been stuck in outdated ideas of power and exclusivity. Daniel had no intention of storming in and immediately announcing his ownership. No, his plan was far more patient and deliberate. Over the following days, Daniel moved quickly to finalize the purchase of the Carlton. His lawyers meticulously handled the paperwork, keeping his identity concealed from the public. The current management had no idea who their new boss was, and Daniel intended to keep it that way for a while longer. Flashback to Daniel's struggles. The process of buying the Carlton brought back memories of Daniel's past struggles. He thought of his early years, hustling between jobs while taking night classes in real estate. At one point, he had barely enough money to pay rent, yet he refused to quit. He had always been determined to succeed, no matter the obstacles. The lessons he learned growing up, how to stay patient in the face of adversity, and how to keep moving forward no matter how many doors were slammed in his face, would serve him well now. He wasn't going to let a handful of judgmental hotel staff rattle him. The purchase finalized. A week later, the deal was done. The Carlton was officially his. Daniel stood in his lawyer's office, staring down at the signed contracts. It was a surreal moment, a reminder of just how far he had come from the boy who had once been told he wouldn't amount to anything. The ink was barely dry, but in Daniel's mind, his work was just beginning. His lawyer, Marcus Tate, a sharp, experienced man in his 50s, handed Daniel the final papers. "Congratulations," Marcus said with a smile. "You've done it. The hotel's yours." Daniel nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere, already on the next steps. "Thanks, Marcus," Daniel replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Now it's time to get to work." Return to the Carlton. Daniel made his way back to the Carlton the following afternoon, this time with a new purpose. He no longer walked through the grand entrance as an outsider. He was the owner now, even though no one knew it yet. As he entered the lobby, the same opulent surroundings greeted him: the marble floors, the golden chandeliers, the high-end clientele milling about. Yet there was a shift in the way Daniel saw it all now. This place was his, and it was about to change. The same staff who had dismissed him before were still working. They still held their air of superiority, completely unaware that the man they had looked down upon was now in control. The front desk manager, Jack Sanders, was standing behind the reception, once again overseeing operations, with a smug expression. Daniel observed him carefully, noting the practiced smiles and rehearsed gestures. Jack spoke with a guest, his tone dripping with fake charm, while giving subtle cues to the bellboys and concierge staff. Daniel didn't approach the desk just yet. He took his time walking through the lobby, watching the interactions, observing the way the staff operated. He saw the quick, judgmental glances, the way they subtly ignored certain guests while lavishing attention on others who looked like they belonged. First, subtle changes. Over the next few days, Daniel began making small changes from behind the scenes. Promotions were announced for a few employees who had long been overlooked, particularly Lena Matthews, a hard-working African-American woman who had been stuck in a low-level position for years. Lena was known among the staff for her dedication, but her efforts had gone largely unnoticed by the management, until now. Lena's promotion to a managerial role was met with mixed reactions. Some of the staff were surprised, others resentful. Jack Sanders in particular wasn't pleased. He had assumed that any new promotions would come through him, but it was clear he no longer had that power. Still, no one knew who was behind the changes, and Daniel intended to keep it that way for a while longer. Resistance from Jack and Tom. As the subtle changes continued, tension began to build among the senior staff. Jack Sanders and Tom Reynolds, the head of security, had started to notice the shift in dynamics, and they didn't like it. Jack had always been the gatekeeper of the Carlton, ensuring that only a certain type of guest and employee fit into the hotel's pristine image. The promotions of individuals like Lena Matthews didn't fit into his narrow view of what the hotel should be. Late one afternoon, Jack and Tom met privately in Jack's office. The door was closed, and their voices were low, but their frustration was clear. "This place is going to hell," Jack muttered, pacing the room. "Promoting someone like Lena? I don't know who's making these decisions, but it's ridiculous." Tom leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I've noticed it too, he said. Something's changing around here, and it's not for the better. Jack shook his head, his face red with anger. We can't let this continue. If they keep promoting people like her, this hotel will lose its reputation. The high-end clients come here because of what we've built, a place for the elite, not for just anyone. Tom nodded in agreement. We need to figure out who's pulling the strings. Someone's behind this. They didn't realize just how close they were to the truth. Daniel's quiet observations. Daniel was aware of their resistance. He wasn't surprised. People like Jack and Tom were used to holding on to power, and they wouldn't give it up without a fight. But Daniel didn't intend to confront them just yet. He wanted to see how far they would go, how deeply their prejudices ran. Over the next few weeks, Daniel continued to observe the staff. He watched how they treated guests of color, how their attitudes subtly shifted when interacting with people who didn't fit their idea of wealth or status. He made notes, cataloged every interaction in his mind, and waited. The more Daniel saw, the more determined he became. This wasn't just about owning a hotel. It was about changing a toxic culture that had been allowed to thrive for too long. But he knew that change wouldn't come easily. People like Jack Sanders and Tom Reynolds were deeply entrenched in their ways, and they wouldn't go quietly. Building to the first crescendo, the tension in the hotel was growing. Staff members were starting to whisper, wondering about the sudden promotions and subtle changes in the hotel's operations. Jack and Tom were becoming increasingly suspicious, but they still had no idea who was really behind it all. Daniel was patient. He knew that the moment of reckoning was coming soon, but he wasn't in a hurry. He wanted to give them enough time to reveal their true colors, to let their arrogance and prejudice rise to the surface before he finally revealed his hand. And when he did, their world would come crashing down. The reveal. It was a crisp morning when Daniel Carter returned to the Carlton for what would be his most pivotal visit. Dressed impeccably as always, he walked through the grand entrance feeling the familiar chill of the staff's indifference. Today, however, Daniel was not simply a guest. Today, he was the owner. Jack Sanders stood behind the front desk, overseeing the day's operations with his usual sense of superiority. He didn't notice Daniel at first, but when their eyes met, Jack's practiced smile appeared. To him, Daniel was still just another guest, unimportant, forgettable. Daniel approached the reception desk with quiet confidence. Jack glanced at him, then quickly turned his attention back to a wealthier-looking couple who had just walked in. Daniel waited, observing the way Jack's demeanor shifted as he fawned over the couple, giving them all his attention. It was almost amusing. After several minutes of being ignored, Daniel decided it was time. He walked past the front desk and made his way toward the conference room, where a meeting with the hotel's senior staff was about to begin. Jack barely noticed Daniel leave, too focused on charming the wealthy guests. The staff meeting. The room was filled with senior staff members when Daniel entered. Conversations were low, with everyone discussing the recent promotions and changes. Lena Matthews sat near the front, her eyes focused, ready to prove herself in her new role as head of operations. Jack Sanders sat near the back, arms crossed, clearly agitated. The meeting was called to order by Helen Granger, the hotel's marketing director, who had been with the Carlton for years. She stood at the front, beginning to talk about upcoming events and business updates, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Daniel quietly slipped into the room and took a seat in the back. He watched as the staff continued to talk, blissfully unaware that the person who now owned the hotel was sitting right in front of them. When the general updates were finished, Helen cleared her throat, preparing to move to the next agenda item. But before she could continue, Daniel stood up. "I'd like to say a few words," he said calmly, walking to the front of the room. The staff turned to look at him, confusion crossing their faces. Jack sat up straighter, his brow furrowed, trying to place who this man was and why he thought he had the authority to speak. Daniel reached the front of the room and turned to face the staff. He could feel their eyes on him, their curiosity building. They still had no idea. "I'm Daniel Carter," he began, his voice steady and calm. "And as of today, I'm the new owner of the Carlton Hotel." Silence. Complete and utter silence. The staff stared at him, their faces frozen in shock. Jack Sanders, the man who had dismissed Daniel as insignificant, looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Daniel let the silence linger for a moment longer before continuing. For too long, this hotel has operated under a system of prejudice and exclusivity, he said, his voice growing more firm. That ends today. The impact. The staff sat in stunned silence as Daniel laid out his vision for the future of the Carlton. He spoke about respect, about equality, and about how every guest would now be treated with the dignity they deserved, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. Jack's face reddened with anger as Daniel spoke, but he said nothing. He could feel his control slipping away, the power he had wielded for years crumbling in front of him. Tom Reynolds, the head of security, sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes downcast. He too understood that things were changing, and not in his favor. I know that some of you may not agree with these changes, Daniel said, looking directly at Jack and Tom. But this hotel will no longer tolerate discrimination or arrogance. If you cannot adapt to the new rules, you're free to leave. The room was thick with tension. Jack's fists clenched at his sides, but he remained silent. Daniel's words echoed in the room, leaving everyone with no doubt that the old ways of the Carlton were over. The staff's reaction. As the meeting came to an end, the staff slowly began to process what had just happened. Some looked relieved, like Lena Matthews, who finally saw that her hard work and dedication were being recognized. Others, like Jack and Tom, were clearly struggling to come to terms with the loss of control. Outside the conference room, whispers spread quickly. The news of Daniel's ownership moved through the hotel like wildfire, leaving the staff buzzing with a mix of confusion, excitement, and unease. Some welcomed the changes with open arms, eager to see a new culture take root. Others, however, were resistant, unsure of what this new era meant for their future. A confrontation with Jack and Tom. Later that day, Daniel made his way through the hotel, observing the staff as they went about their duties. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the way they hesitated, unsure of how to interact with him now that he was their boss. As Daniel entered the lobby, he was approached by Jack Sanders, his face set in a mask of strained politeness. Tom Reynolds was at his side, arms crossed, his expression hard. "Mr. Carter," Jack began, his voice tight. "A word, if you don't mind." Daniel nodded, and they moved to a quiet corner of the lobby. Jack wasted no time. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Jack said, his tone low but sharp. "But this hotel has a reputation to uphold. The clientele expect a certain level of exclusivity." Daniel remained calm, letting Jack's words wash over him. He had anticipated this reaction. "I understand that change can be difficult," Daniel replied evenly. "But the Carlton's future is not about exclusivity. It's about respect and equality. If you're unable to adjust to that, you're welcome to find another place to work." Jack's eyes flashed with anger. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? This hotel was built on tradition. You're going to destroy it." Daniel's gaze hardened. "I'm not destroying anything, Jack. I'm building something better, something that treats every guest and employee with the respect they deserve." Tom, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "This place is going to fall apart if you let just anyone walk in here. You'll lose the elite clients. They don't want to rub shoulders with—" He stopped short, realizing how far he had gone. Daniel's expression didn't change. "If you believe that certain guests don't deserve respect because of the color of their skin, then you have no place in my hotel." Jack and Tom stared at Daniel, their faces a mixture of anger and disbelief. They had never imagined they would lose their grip on the Carlton, and now they were facing the reality that their time was over. The aftermath. As Jack and Tom walked away, their arrogance broken, Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about something far more important. The transformation of the Carlton from a symbol of exclusion to one of inclusion. Over the next few weeks, Daniel continued to implement changes. Staff members who had long been overlooked, like Lena Matthews, were promoted to leadership positions. Diversity and inclusion training became mandatory, and the culture of the Carlton slowly began to shift. The hotel's transformation wasn't without resistance. Some longtime staff members left, unable to accept the new direction. But Daniel knew that true change was never easy. It required patience, perseverance, and most importantly, a belief in the possibility of a better future. Resistance to change. As the days passed, the initial shock of Daniel Carter's ownership slowly faded, but not without consequences. Jack Sanders and Tom Reynolds were not willing to let go of their old ways without a fight. Even though they hadn't directly challenged Daniel during their confrontation, behind closed doors, they began to quietly undermine the changes he was implementing. Jack, the former manager, felt the sting of losing his control over the hotel. He had always prided himself on maintaining the Carlton's exclusivity, a reputation he believed was built on keeping out those who didn't fit his image of what luxury looked like. Now, with Daniel in charge, everything felt like it was spiraling out of his control. Jack began having private conversations with some of the more influential staff members who had been at the Carlton for years. He tried to rally them, playing on their fears that the hotel's clientele would change for the worse. "We built this place on tradition," Jack would say, his voice low but persuasive. "If we let anyone come in, we'll lose the elite. This hotel will become just another ordinary establishment. We can't let that happen." Tom, on the other hand, took a different approach. His anger simmered under the surface, but he still carried himself with the same arrogance he always had. Although he hadn't confronted Daniel again directly, his actions spoke volumes. Tom subtly encouraged the security staff to be stricter with guests who didn't fit the hotel's traditional image, even as the rest of the hotel began to change. He held on to the power he thought he still had, clinging to the idea that he could maintain control. Lena Matthews, now in a position of authority as head of operations, began to notice the resistance. She had worked at the Carlton for years and knew the culture well. Though she was determined to embrace the changes Daniel was bringing, she could sense that not everyone was on board. In private meetings, Lena often found herself the target of passive-aggressive comments from Jack and Tom. They were careful never to be overtly disrespectful, but it was clear they didn't respect her authority. Lena, however, remained professional. She knew the hotel's culture wasn't going to change overnight, but she had no intention of backing down. Daniel's observations. Daniel was well aware of the resistance. Though Jack and Tom hadn't openly defied him, he could feel the undercurrents of discontent. He had anticipated this. Change was never easy, especially when it threatened the power structures that people like Jack and Tom had relied on for so long. Still, Daniel remained patient. He observed the way the staff interacted, taking note of subtle shifts in behavior. The more inclusive environment he was trying to foster was beginning to take root. Guests of color and those from less traditional backgrounds were slowly starting to feel more welcomed, thanks to the changes he and Lena were implementing. But Daniel also knew that the old guard, those who clung to the past, would not go down without a fight. As part of his observation, Daniel began to conduct one-on-one meetings with various staff members, gauging their feelings about the direction the hotel was taking. Most of the newer employees were enthusiastic about the changes. They were excited to see a hotel that valued diversity and respect, one that didn't judge people based on appearance or background. But the older staff, those like Jack and Tom, were less forthcoming. They tried to remain polite, but Daniel could see through their carefully chosen words. Their resistance wasn't just about tradition, it was about fear of losing the power and privilege they had taken for granted for so long. Whispers of dissatisfaction. The tension among the staff grew thicker by the day. Whispers spread through the hallways, and the divide between those who embraced the changes and those who resisted them became more apparent. Some of the longtime employees began to feel uneasy, unsure which side they should take. At staff meetings, Lena often found herself facing cold stares from Jack and his allies. But rather than shrinking under the pressure, Lena rose to the challenge. She led the meetings with confidence, focusing on the practical changes they were making to improve the guest experience. Her professionalism and poise in the face of resistance earned her respect from those who had once dismissed her. Still, there was a sense of unease in the air. The staff could feel the hotel's culture shifting, and not everyone was comfortable with it. The hotel's reputation had been built on the idea that it catered to a specific, exclusive clientele, and some of the older employees weren't ready to let go of that. A turning point. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Daniel sat in his office overlooking the city. He had been reflecting on the progress they had made and the challenges that still lay ahead. He knew he had to make a decision about how to handle Jack and Tom's continued resistance. His mind wandered to a conversation he had had with Lena earlier that day. She had shared her concerns about the quiet but growing pushback from some of the staff. Jack's influence is still strong, Lena had said, her voice steady but serious. There are a few people who look to him as the leader, even if they don't say it outright. Daniel had nodded. He had always known this battle wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected Jack and Tom to hold on for this long. It was time to take a more direct approach. The next morning, Daniel called a private meeting with Jack and Tom. It was time to address the issue head-on. The confrontation. Jack and Tom entered Daniel's office with forced politeness. They knew why they had been called in, and they were ready to defend themselves. But Daniel wasn't interested in hearing excuses. "We need to talk," Daniel began, his voice calm but firm. "I know what's been happening behind the scenes. The resistance to the changes we're making here, it's coming from you." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but Daniel held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not interested in excuses. I gave you the opportunity to adapt to the new direction we're taking, but it's clear that you're not willing to do that." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual arrogance fading. "We're just trying to keep the hotel's reputation intact," he said, his tone defensive. Daniel's gaze hardened. "The hotel's reputation is changing, whether you like it or not. This place will no longer be a symbol of exclusion. We're building something better, something that values respect and equality. If you can't accept that, then you no longer have a place here." The words hung in the air for a moment, and both Jack and Tom knew there was no going back. They had lost. Daniel's patience and resolve had outlasted their resistance, and now they had to make a choice. After a long silence, Jack finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual confidence. "I see," he said, standing up. "I guess it's time for me to go." Tom, seeing that his ally had given in, followed suit. "Yeah, me too," he muttered. Daniel nodded, watching as they left the office. The door closed softly behind them, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a sense of calm. The aftermath. Jack and Tom's departure sent ripples through the hotel. Some of the older staff members were shocked, but many of the newer employees felt a sense of relief. The power that Jack and Tom had once wielded was gone, and with it, the last remnants of the old culture. Lena Matthews took on even more responsibility after their departure, stepping fully into her role as head of operations. Under her leadership, the hotel began to thrive in new ways. The staff, now free from the oppressive influence of the old regime, found themselves more willing to embrace the changes Daniel had introduced. Guests from all walks of life began to frequent the Carlton, and the hotel's reputation began to shift. It was no longer just a place for the elite. It was a place where everyone could feel welcome and respected. The shift in culture didn't hurt the business, as Jack had feared. In fact, the hotel began attracting a wider range of clients, many of whom appreciated the inclusive atmosphere, building toward the next crescendo. With the old guard gone, the hotel was finally beginning to change, but Daniel knew that the work was far from over. The resistance had been broken, but the deeper cultural transformation was still in progress. He had successfully dismantled the power structures that had kept people like Jack and Tom in control, but now it was time to build something new, a place where everyone could thrive, regardless of their background. As Daniel walked through the lobby one evening, he saw Lena speaking with a group of employees, their faces full of hope and enthusiasm. The change was happening, slowly but surely. But Daniel knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of resistance and more battles to fight. The emotional tension had dropped, but only temporarily. Daniel was preparing for the next phase of his journey, the final push toward complete transformation, where the stakes would be even higher. Cultural shift intensifies. With Jack Sanders and Tom Reynolds gone, the atmosphere at the Carlton began to shift rapidly. The staff felt freer, and the weight of judgment that once hung in the air started to lift. Lena Matthews, now fully in control of operations, wasted no time implementing the changes that Daniel and she had been planning for months. The hotel's daily operations began to reflect the new culture Daniel envisioned, inclusive, respectful, and welcoming to all. Lena's leadership inspired the staff, especially those who had been overlooked for so long. Employees who had been marginalized under Jack's reign now found themselves recognized for their hard work and given more responsibility. But with change came uncertainty. Some of the older employees, still adjusting to the shift in power dynamics, were hesitant. Daniel had anticipated this. The old culture of exclusion had been in place for years, and dismantling it would take time. He knew that pushing the staff too hard could create resistance, but moving too slowly could risk losing momentum. Increasing support for the new direction. Despite the initial resistance, the majority of the staff began to embrace the new direction. Lena was a key figure in this transformation. Her calm and authoritative demeanor won over even the more skeptical employees. She held weekly meetings with the staff, emphasizing the importance of the hotel's new mission: to provide top-tier service to all guests, regardless of background, race, or socioeconomic status. Respect isn't something that's earned based on someone's wealth, Lena said during one of her meetings. It's given to everyone who walks through those doors. The message resonated with many of the employees. They had seen firsthand how judgmental attitudes had affected the hotel's culture in the past, and they were ready for something different. Carlos Diaz, a young bellboy who had been working at the hotel for just a few months, was one of those who fully embraced the changes. He had always been treated as though he were invisible, ignored by management and guests alike. But under Lena's leadership, Carlos found himself valued for the first time. The guests began to notice. The changes in the hotel's culture didn't go unnoticed by the guests. Word began to spread that the Carlton had transformed into a more inclusive, welcoming environment. Guests from diverse backgrounds began to feel more comfortable, and as a result, the hotel's clientele started to shift. Reviews online began to reflect this shift. One particular review from a high-profile guest, a renowned African-American CEO named Victoria Lawson, became a turning point for the hotel. In her glowing review, Victoria praised not only the luxurious accommodations, but also the warm and respectful treatment she received from the staff. "I've stayed in luxury hotels all over the world," she wrote, "but the Carlton is something special. It's not just the chandeliers or the marble floors. It's the way I was treated. Every person, from the bellboy to the head of operations, made me feel like I truly belonged." The review went viral, and soon more and more guests began flocking to the Carlton, drawn not just by the hotel's reputation for luxury, but by the promise of respect and equality, the showdown. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. A small group of influential guests, those who had been regulars at the hotel for years, felt threatened by the new direction. They had always enjoyed the sense of exclusivity that the Carlton provided, and they weren't happy with the idea of sharing that space with people they deemed unworthy. One evening, as Daniel sat in his office reviewing the hotel's latest financial reports, he received a call from Frank Miller, one of the Carlton's oldest and wealthiest clients. Frank had been staying at the hotel for years and was known for his extravagant spending and arrogant demeanor. "Daniel," Frank said, his voice dripping with entitlement, "I've heard some things about the changes you're making at the hotel. I'm not sure I like where this is going." Daniel leaned back in his chair, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "What exactly are you concerned about, Frank?" "Well, let's just say I've noticed a different kind of crowd in the lobby lately. It used to be that I could walk into the Carlton and know that everyone here was someone worth knowing. Now I'm not so sure. I don't know if this place is for me anymore." Daniel remained calm, his voice measured. "Frank, the Carlton is for anyone who values respect and quality service. That hasn't changed." Frank's tone turned cold. "I don't like this new direction, Daniel. I've been loyal to this hotel for years, and I spend a lot of money here. I think you should reconsider these changes before you lose your best clients." Daniel paused, letting the weight of Frank's words settle. He had faced this kind of resistance before, but it still stung to hear it from someone who had benefited so much from the hotel's old ways. "I appreciate your business, Frank," Daniel said finally, "but the Carlton isn't going back to what it was. If you can't accept that, maybe it's time for you to find another hotel." Frank was silent for a moment, clearly not expecting Daniel's firm response. "I see," he said, his voice tight. "Well, I'll be taking my business elsewhere then." Daniel nodded, not surprised by Frank's reaction. I wish you the best, Frank. The call ended, and Daniel sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. He knew that standing by his principles would mean losing some clients, like Frank, who were stuck in their old ways. But he also knew that it was the only way forward. The aftermath of the showdown. Frank Miller's departure sent a clear message to the rest of the Carlton's longtime clients. The hotel was no longer going to cater to exclusivity and arrogance. Some followed Frank's lead, quietly checking out and taking their business elsewhere. But many more stayed, curious to see how the hotel would evolve under Daniel's leadership. Victoria Lawson's review continued to attract new guests from all walks of life, and soon, the Carlton's occupancy rates were higher than ever before. The hotel was thriving, and its reputation as a place of inclusion and respect was growing by the day. Challenges from within. Despite the success, not all the challenges had disappeared. Some of the older staff members still struggled with the new direction. Though they no longer had Jack or Tom to rally behind, there was a quiet unease among those who had been at the hotel for decades. They had been taught to believe that exclusivity was the key to the Carlton's success, and they weren't sure how to operate in this new environment. Lena recognized this tension and decided to address it head-on. She organized a series of workshops for the staff, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The workshops were designed to help the staff understand the importance of treating all guests with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. At first, some of the older employees resisted. They didn't see the need for the training, believing that they had always treated guests with respect. But as the workshops progressed, many of them began to see things differently. Maria Bennett, a longtime concierge, had been one of the most resistant at first. But during one of the workshops, she had a realization. I guess I never really thought about how my behavior might come across, Maria said quietly during one of the sessions. I always thought I was being polite, but maybe I wasn't giving everyone the same level of attention. Lena nodded, encouraging Maria to continue. It's not about pointing fingers, Lena said gently. It's about recognizing where we can do better. By the end of the workshops, even the most skeptical employees began to see the value in what Daniel and Lena were building. The hotel wasn't just changing on the surface, it was transforming from the inside out. A new culture takes root. As the weeks passed, the changes at the Carlton became more noticeable. The staff began to embody the hotel's new values, treating every guest with genuine warmth and respect. Guests from diverse backgrounds felt welcomed in ways they never had before, and word of the hotel's transformation spread throughout the city. Daniel, who had remained mostly in the background during this time, observed the changes with quiet satisfaction. He had always believed in the power of patience, and now his vision for the hotel was becoming a reality. But Daniel wasn't finished yet. He knew that the hardest part of change wasn't the initial push. It was making sure the change lasted. The final challenge, just when it seemed like things were going smoothly, a new challenge emerged. One evening, Daniel received a call from Marcus Tate, his lawyer. There had been rumblings from a group of investors who were concerned about the direction the Carlton was taking. They had supported Daniel's purchase of the hotel, but now they were questioning whether the changes were good for business. They're worried that you're alienating the elite clientele, Marcus explained over the phone. They think you might be risking the hotel's profitability by focusing too much on inclusivity. Daniel felt a familiar frustration rising within him. He had always known that the road to true change would be filled with obstacles, but it was disheartening to hear that even his investors were questioning his decisions. Let them know that the Carlton is more profitable than ever, Daniel replied firmly. We're attracting a wider range of guests, and our occupancy rates are higher than they've been in years. The numbers speak for themselves, Marcus sighed. I'll do my best to convince them, but you might have to meet with the board to settle this. Daniel nodded, already preparing for the next battle. The investors were powerful, but Daniel knew that standing by his values was more important than bowing to pressure. He wasn't just running a business, he was changing a culture, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. The investors' challenge. Daniel sat at the head of the large boardroom table, facing the investors who had supported his purchase of the Carlton months ago. They were a group of well-dressed, powerful individuals, some of whom had been in the luxury hotel business for decades. Marcus Tate, Daniel's lawyer, sat beside him, silently watching the investors as they shuffled their papers and exchanged glances. At the far end of the table, Robert Fletcher, one of the most prominent investors, spoke first. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of concern beneath his words. "Daniel, we appreciate everything you've done for the hotel. The Carlton's numbers are good. Great, in fact. But there are concerns," Robert said, his eyes sweeping across the room as if to gather silent support from the others. "Some of our more traditional clients have left. They were loyal, long-term patrons who spent a lot of money here. And while we see that occupancy rates are up, there's a fear that we're losing the clientele that gave this hotel its elite status." The other investors nodded in agreement. Daniel could see the anxiety in their eyes, the fear that the Carlton's prestige was at risk. Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I understand your concerns. Yes, we've lost some long-term clients, but the truth is, the Carlton can no longer rely on exclusivity and tradition alone. We're bringing in a wider range of guests now, and that's the future. We can't hold on to the past and expect to thrive." One of the investors, Diane Morgan, interjected. "But are we sacrificing luxury? The Carlton has always been synonymous with exclusivity. That's why people come here. They want to feel like they're part of something special." Daniel shook his head. "We're not sacrificing luxury. We're elevating it. We're making it clear that luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about providing the best service, the best experience, and that's something everyone deserves, not just a select few." There was a long pause in the room. The investors were processing Daniel's words, but he could tell that some of them weren't convinced. A deeper tension. After the meeting, Daniel walked back to his office, his mind racing. He knew the investors would be a challenge, but their reluctance to fully embrace the changes he was implementing made him feel like he was fighting the same battle over and over. The old guard, the people who clung to the past, were everywhere, not just in the staff, but in the very foundations of the hotel's ownership. Later that evening, Daniel called Lena Matthews to discuss the meeting. She listened carefully as he recounted the investors' concerns, nodding thoughtfully as she processed the information. "I expected something like this," Lena said finally. "When you're changing a system that's been in place for so long, you're going to meet resistance at every level. But you've already proven that the changes are working." Daniel nodded, appreciating her support. "I know. The numbers are solid, but it's hard convincing people who see the world through the lens of exclusivity. To them, any change feels like a threat." Lena leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "You've already done the hard part, Daniel. You've changed the culture. Now it's about making sure that culture sticks. The investors need to see that this isn't just a short-term success. It's the new foundation of the hotel." Daniel smiled, reassured by Lena's confidence. She was right. The changes they had implemented weren't just surface level. They were transforming the very essence of the hotel. And as long as they kept pushing forward, the hotel's new direction would prove itself. An unlikely ally. In the days following the investor meeting, Daniel received an unexpected phone call from Victoria Lawson, the high-profile CEO who had left the glowing review of the Carlton after her stay. "Daniel," Victoria began, her voice warm and confident, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done at the Carlton. I've been recommending the hotel to all of my colleagues, and the feedback has been incredible. People are loving the changes." Daniel smiled. "Thank you, Victoria. That means a lot." "I also heard that you've been facing some pushback," Victoria continued. "From the investors, I assume?" Daniel sighed. "Yes, they're concerned that we're losing the old clientele. They're worried that the hotel's reputation is changing too much, too quickly." Victoria paused for a moment before speaking again. "I understand their concerns, but they're wrong. The future of luxury is inclusivity. People don't just want marble floors and chandeliers anymore. They want to feel valued. They want to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Daniel nodded, agreeing with her wholeheartedly. "That's exactly what we're trying to do." "I know," Victoria replied, her voice full of conviction. "And I'm going to help you. I'll be back in New York next week, and I'd like to meet with some of your investors. Maybe hearing from someone like me will help them see the value in what you're building." Daniel felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Having someone as influential as Victoria on his side would make all the difference. Thank you, Victoria. That would be incredible. Victoria's influence. A week later, Victoria Lawson returned to the Carlton and met with the board of investors. She spoke with the same confidence and authority that had made her one of the most successful CEOs in the country. But this time, she wasn't just talking about her own experience at the hotel. She was talking about the future of the entire luxury industry. The Carlton is ahead of the curve, Victoria said, addressing the investors with a firm yet persuasive tone. Other hotels are going to follow this model in the years to come. Inclusivity is the future. The world is changing, and people want to be part of a luxury experience that makes them feel like they belong. This isn't about losing elite clients. It's about redefining what luxury means. And trust me, the people who matter, they're going to love it. The investors listened intently, clearly affected by Victoria's words. She was someone they respected, someone who understood both business and luxury. Hearing her endorse Daniel's vision gave them the reassurance they needed. After the meeting, Robert Fletcher approached Daniel with a more open attitude. "You've got someone powerful in your corner," he said with a smile. "Victoria makes a strong case. Maybe we've been too focused on the past. I think it's time to start looking forward." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of relief. The investors had been a major hurdle, but with Victoria's help, he had finally convinced them that the Carlton's new direction was the right one. A solid future. With the investors on board, Daniel could now focus fully on the hotel's continued transformation. The staff, once hesitant, had now fully embraced the changes. Lena continued to lead with grace and authority, and the atmosphere at the Carlton had shifted permanently. The guests, too, felt the difference. Every person who walked through the doors of the hotel, no matter their background, felt valued and respected. Carlos Diaz, the young bellboy who had once been invisible under the old regime, now found himself in a supervisory role. His dedication and enthusiasm hadn't gone unnoticed, and he quickly became one of the most respected members of the staff. His story was just one of many examples of how the new culture at the Carlton was lifting people up, giving them opportunities they never would have had before. The hotel's reputation continued to grow, not just for its luxurious accommodations, but for its commitment to inclusivity. Guests from all over the world flocked to the Carlton, eager to experience the warmth and respect that the hotel had become known for. Daniel's reflection. One evening, Daniel stood in the lobby of the Carlton, watching the guests move through the space. He saw people from all walks of life, from different cultures and backgrounds, all enjoying the same level of luxury and service. The hotel was thriving, not just financially, but in spirit. The vision he had for the Carlton, a place where everyone could feel valued, was now a reality. As he walked toward the grand staircase, he saw Lena speaking with a group of guests. Her face lit up with the same passion and determination she had shown since the beginning. Daniel smiled to himself, knowing that she was a big part of why the hotel had succeeded. In that moment, Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had fought for this change, pushing through resistance at every level. He had faced prejudice, arrogance, and doubt, but he had never wavered in his belief that the Carlton could be something more. And now it was. Facing the industry giants. With the Carlton thriving under its new direction, Daniel felt a sense of accomplishment, but he knew there was still one final challenge ahead. The changes he had made to the hotel had attracted attention from the broader hospitality industry. While some praised his approach, there were still powerful figures in the luxury hotel world who saw inclusivity as a threat to their carefully curated exclusivity. They feared that if the Carlton continued on its current path, it would set a precedent that could disrupt the industry. A few weeks after his meeting with the investors, Daniel received an invitation to speak at the annual Luxury Hospitality Summit in New York. It was the most prestigious event in the industry, attended by hotel owners, investors, and key players from around the world. Daniel knew this was his opportunity to solidify his vision, not just for the Carlton, but for the future of luxury hospitality. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The industry giants who controlled the luxury hotel market had spent decades building their brands on exclusivity, and they weren't going to accept change without a fight. Preparing for the summit. In the days leading up to the summit, Daniel worked closely with Lena and Marcus Tate to prepare for his presentation. They knew that the audience would be skeptical and that Daniel would need to make a compelling case for why inclusivity was not just a moral choice, but a smart business decision. "Remember, they're going to push back hard," Marcus said during one of their prep sessions. "These are people who've built their empires on the idea that luxury is for the elite. You're asking them to rethink everything they've done." Daniel nodded, already knowing what was at stake. "I'm not asking them to give up luxury," he replied. "I'm asking them to redefine it." Lena smiled, her confidence in Daniel unwavering. "You've already proven it can work. The Carlton is the proof they need. Just show them the numbers, the success stories, and the vision. They won't be able to argue with results." The day of the summit. The day of the summit arrived, and Daniel stood backstage, mentally preparing for what was to come. He could hear the murmur of the crowd as industry leaders gathered in the grand ballroom of one of New York's most exclusive hotels. The room was filled with influential people, owners of luxury hotel chains, investors, and even a few celebrities who had built their brands around the idea of exclusivity. As Daniel waited for his turn to speak, he saw Victoria Lawson enter the room. She gave him a reassuring nod, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. She had been one of his strongest allies, and her presence gave him the boost of confidence he needed. When it was finally time for Daniel to take the stage, the room quieted. All eyes were on him as he walked to the podium, his calm and confident demeanor hiding the nerves he felt inside. He knew that this moment could define not only the future of the Carlton, but also his role in reshaping the luxury hotel industry. The presentation. Daniel began by addressing the room with a sense of purpose. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady. "Today I'm here to talk about the future of luxury hospitality. For decades, this industry has thrived on the idea of exclusivity, of creating spaces that cater to a select few. But the world is changing, and with it, the expectations of luxury." He paused for a moment, scanning the faces in the room. Some looked intrigued, while others appeared skeptical. But Daniel pressed on. "I know many of you have concerns," he continued. "You've built your brands on exclusivity, and you worry that opening the doors to a more inclusive approach will dilute the luxury experience. But I'm here to tell you that inclusivity is not the enemy of luxury. In fact, it's the future." Daniel went on to share the story of the Carlton's transformation. He talked about how, under the old regime, the hotel had relied on exclusivity to maintain its status, but how that approach had alienated many potential clients. He then presented the results of the changes he and Lena had implemented: higher occupancy rates, more diverse clientele, and glowing reviews from guests who had once felt excluded. "The numbers don't lie," Daniel said, pointing to a graph that showed the Carlton's financial growth over the past year. "We're seeing more guests than ever before, and they're spending more money because they feel valued. They feel like they belong in a space that offers them both luxury and respect." The pushback. As expected, Daniel's presentation was met with resistance. After he finished, Robert Blake, the CEO of one of the largest luxury hotel chains in the world, stood up to challenge him. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter," Robert began, his voice tinged with condescension, "what you're proposing is a fundamental shift in what makes luxury, well, luxury. People come to our hotels because they want to feel like they're part of an exclusive world. They don't want to be rubbing shoulders with just anyone." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Daniel knew this was the heart of the issue. For people like Robert, exclusivity was synonymous with luxury. They couldn't see that the world had moved on from that mindset. Daniel remained calm, ready for this moment. "I understand your concern, Robert," he said, his voice measured. "But I think you're underestimating what people want. Yes, people want luxury. They want the best. But they also want to feel respected. They want to be treated as equals. And if we're going to survive in this industry, we need to adapt to that reality." Victoria's support. As the tension in the room built, Victoria Lawson stood up to add her voice to the conversation. "I've stayed in hotels all over the world," she said, her voice strong and authoritative. "And let me tell you, there's a shift happening. People don't just want a fancy room with gold-plated faucets. They want to feel like they're valued, regardless of who they are. That's what the Carlton is doing. and that's why it's thriving. Her words carried weight, and Daniel could see that some of the attendees were starting to rethink their positions. Victoria was one of the most successful business leaders in the country, and her endorsement of Daniel's vision made them reconsider their long-held beliefs. The turning point. After a few more tense exchanges, Daniel sensed that the tide was beginning to turn. He had expected resistance, but he also knew that the success of the Carlton spoke for itself. The data was undeniable, and the story of the hotel's transformation resonated with many in the room. By the end of the summit, Daniel had convinced a number of key players in the industry that inclusivity was not a threat to luxury, but a necessary evolution. He had faced down the giants of the industry and had shown them that the future of hospitality was about creating spaces where everyone felt welcome. The new era of luxury. In the weeks following the summit, Daniel received calls and emails from hotel owners and investors who were interested in following the Carlton's model. They wanted to know how they could create more inclusive environments while maintaining their luxury standards. Daniel, always eager to share his vision, began consulting with other hotel chains, helping them navigate the challenges of transforming their own businesses. Back at the Carlton, the changes continued to flourish. The hotel had become a symbol of what the future of luxury could look like, a place where excellence and equality coexisted. Lena Matthews had taken on an even larger role in the company, helping to oversee new projects and expansion efforts, while Carlos Diaz had moved into a senior management position, a testament to how much the culture at the hotel had changed. Daniel's reflection. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Daniel stood on the rooftop of the Carlton, looking out over the city skyline. He thought back to the day he had first walked into the hotel and been dismissed by the staff, how they had judged him based on nothing but his appearance. Now he was the owner of one of the most successful luxury hotels in the country, and his vision of inclusivity had not only transformed the hotel, but was beginning to transform the entire industry. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the city, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. He had fought for this change, and he had won, not by forcing his way in, but by proving that respect and equality were the true foundations of luxury. The Carlton had become a beacon of what the future of hospitality could be. Daniel's journey had been filled with challenges, but he had remained true to his vision, never wavering in his belief that inclusivity and luxury could coexist. The emotional highs and lows had been worth it, as he now stood at the forefront of a new era in the hotel industry. And as he reflected on the path he had taken, Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. There were still many battles to fight, many minds to change, but he was ready. He had the patience, the persistence, and most importantly, the belief that the world could and should be a place where everyone, no matter their background, could feel valued. As the story concludes, the reader is left with a final reflection on the power of perseverance and the importance of standing by one's values. The conclusion could include a call to action, inviting readers to think about how they, too, can challenge systems of inequality in their own industries or lives. And of course, an invitation to subscribe to the platform that shared this inspiring story with a note like, if you've enjoyed this story of transformation and believe in the power of change, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this, stories that challenge the status quo and inspire action.